Good evening, everyone. My name is Connor Moran. I'm the director of the Wisconsin Book Festival. Thank you so much for joining us to celebrate Celeste Headlee and her new book, Speaking of Race. We are joined by Celeste and also by Lucia Nunez, who is Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Madison College here in Madison, Wisconsin. Celeste, Lucia, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you much, Connor.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
It's great to have you. Before we get started, as always, I want to thank Madison Public Library, the Madison Public Library Foundation, and all of our sponsors. Their steadfast support of free cultural events in our community, in our state, in our country now, with digital events has been absolutely steadfast. They never blinked an eye about having these types of events all throughout the pandemic. So thank you to all of them. And thank you to all of you watching at home. This book is, as you're going to find out, just an absolutely remarkable, I don't even know what the word is, tool, book, piece of just insight. And Celeste is here to talk to us all about it. We are going to use our gift from Cheryl Rosen-Weston's estate tonight, and we are going to offer free copies of Celeste's book, Speaking of Race, to anyone who is watching. Right when I get done speaking, I will put a link, the green button underneath your screen. All you have to do is click the link, put in your address, and our bookselling partners at A Room of One's Own Bookstore will send you a free copy, courtesy of the Wisconsin Book Festival. This is a book that we need to get in readers' hands. Celeste, thank you so much for this book, and I can't wait for people to read it at home.
That's so exciting. Free books.
Free books. Yep.
Free books.
They're truly free, so really take advantage. I'm going to hand it over to Lucia Nunez, and I will disappear. I'll see everyone at the end. Thanks so much, everyone.
Cool. Well, thank you, Connor, and welcome everybody to just another incredible event for the Wisconsin Book Festival. Celeste, I'm honored to have this conversation with you. I need to show you my book. I probably went through a packet and a half of Post-its, and there were so many books that you referenced that I've never read. So I've got a list a mile long and information that I need to remember. And let me tell you, I start reading a book from the back. I look at the bibliography, I look at your resources. And by the way, this resource page, the pages in the back are fantastic. This is exactly the kind of resource page we want to put up on the Office of Equity and Inclusion. Read this book. And then I look at the table of contents. I look to see, do I have a roadmap that makes sense in my brain? And then I start reading. And, so many times we bring in authors and we read fantastic books. But one of the things that people tell us is, how do I use this in my classroom? How is this relevant to my students? And, why is this important? How is it relevant even in my personal life? So the fact that you give this great context and then you give tools it's great. And to give you a little bit of background, I'm the VP of Equity and Inclusion. So our office, we put together diversity training and co-learning and thinking about what does race mean? What does equity mean? How is anti-racism important at an institution like Madison College? So how do we go deeper? So this is exactly, and just to show you how this book has already transformed, yesterday I facilitated a conversation and I rewrote the group agreements based on your Geneva Protocol of conversation, right? And I started thinking about one of the first questions you ask is, what are your motivations or desires to have a conversation about race? And I have to be honest, I asked myself that question, and this isn't easy, right? I think you gave me permission in the book to sometimes I wish I worked in a yarn shop, that this is a hard job.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
sometimes, that there's some weeks that it's like, oh my God, death by 1,000 little cuts. And so I always feel guilty about having escapist thoughts, right? But you gave me that permission. Like sometimes we don't want to talk about race. Sometimes it's not safe to talk about race. So I want to ask you some questions, and I love the power of this exercise that you start out with. Imagine a world like, what if Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. didn't have to deal with all of the injustices and racism that he had to? What could he have done? And why do you start with that?
I just want to show how, in some sense, how ludicrous this all is. And to a certain extent, it's a way to sort of diminish this to a size where we know we can overcome it, right? Because this is, in some ways, it's deadly. I'm not, diminishing the danger of racism. I'm just saying the concept of it is stupid, right? Race does not exist. Just like sexism doesn't exist, all these things that we think are associated with gender, the more we know about the brain and the physiology, they turn out to just be hokum. And it's the exact same thing with race. It doesn't exist. And yet race is real only because racism is real. So just imagine the other side of this, right? Imagine if we can get through this. What Ida B. Wells would have done with her time, with that magnificent talent and energy and passion, what would she have focused on, right? If she didn't have to try to stop lynching and to help people get themselves in that mindset. I think I'm sure it can be frustrating to think about that, but I also think there's an inherent optimism to that, of imagining a parallel universe in which we conquered this thing.
Yeah. And it doesn't exist. And we can creative, reach our potential in such great ways. Let me go back. You said something. Let's talk about the science, because you dedicate a lot of time to science in this, in studies that I could probably spend the whole hour talking to you just about that. You cite one study about how our brain works, and that our brains get a boost of dopamine every time we hear something, right, that confirms the way we believe. And why is this important in this discussion? And I'm going to ask, how do you think social media sort of feeds into this, right? Because we spent a lot of time on these little apparatus, and we see things that confirm our beliefs. So how does that feed into some of the science that you start out with?
Well, there's many great uses for social media. Conversations about race is not one of them. There should be no conversations about race on social media. And again, I'm not saying that because I'm going to trying to dump on Facebook. This is one of the reasons I put so much science in the book, is just to show you, look, many of these things can be tested and measured and quantified. We know what a brain looks like when it's interacting over social media versus the way it's interacting when you're speaking to someone in person or on the phone, for example. And so we know that conversation you're having over social media, you are less likely to be compassionate, less likely to be generous. You're more likely to be pushed toward the extremes of your opinion. That's why it polarizes so much. And again, we are mostly seeking out things that feed our confirmation bias, that feed our need to say, to reassure us that we're right. And when you mention dopamine is a neurotransmitter, right? That it's essential for our functioning, but we're getting too much of it. And part of it is from social media. Every time you refresh your social media feed, you're getting a shot of dopamine. Dopamine is addictive. It's what you get a shot of when you pull a slot machine arm. It is very short term. It's felt in your body, which means it's a visceral feeling. It inspires taking and greed. It's basically the neurotransmitter that says that felt good and I need more, right? Too much of it can lead to addiction. This is opposed to like a serotonin that you get when you have a conversation on the phone or in person, which is called the happiness hormone. Serotonin is felt almost entirely in the brain. It's cerebral, it's generally shared, and it's the type of neurotransmitter that says that felt good and I feel good. So these are two different things. And we know this is what happens. We can watch the brain while it's interacting. And that's why it's so important, rather than trying to deny any of this stuff, just to accept our bodies the way that they work and the way that they are, and carry out our business and have these conversations in a way that works with our body rather than against it.
Makes total sense, and it explains why you start with that foundation of science and the importance of you talk about the importance of psychology and neuroscience. You've just laid that out for us. I had never heard of that system 1 versus system 2 thinking.
Yeah, system 1, it's interesting. Many people don't connect it because it's not in their field, but Daniel Kahneman wrote a lot about economics. He was both a psychologist and an economist, right? So he was always trying to study why we buy the things we do, why our behavior as consumers and members of the economy was the way that it was. But this system 1 and system 2 thinking explains so much about bias, that some of it is just the fact that we still have a lizard brain living inside our skulls. And that's the one that works quickly. It makes perfect sense that your executive functioning takes a little more time, and we have to give it that time.
Let me ask one of the questions, right? Who is racist? And, I can't be racist. Oh my God, I'm the VP of inclusion. How could I be racist? Immediately, let me start pointing fingers, right? Away from it. And that's one of the foundational things. And you also talked about that better than average effect. That's another study, right? That explains some of this, like, I can't be racist, but they are over there.
Right. At least I'm less racist. Interesting enough on that matter, the better than average effect affects us in all kinds of ways. For example, I think it's like 75% to 80% of people say they're better than average drivers, which obviously that math doesn't work. So there's all kinds of ways in which we all think we're better than average at things. And racism is one of them. In one particular study, they brought a group of participants in, they gave them a list of possible behaviors and asked them to check off completely anonymously which things they had ever done. Had they ever laughed at a racist joke? Had they ever used the N-word, etc.? And again, they were completely assured of privacy on this. And so that brought out a little more honesty. And sometime later, they said, okay, we want your help in evaluating everybody's quizzes. So we're going to give you somebody else's checklist, and we want you to tell us how racist you think they are. Like, is this a racist person? And so they gave them this checklist, and the people all said, oh, I'm much less racist than this person, like a lot less racist. But of course, they were given their own checklist. So even when they were faced with their own racist behavior, they were absolutely positive they were less racist than this other person who was themselves. So, this is part of the difficulty. We aren't even honest with ourselves. And it was why it was so important. I began the book there by saying, yes, of course you are racist. Of course you make assumptions about other people because of their perceived race. Of course you do. Can we all just stop lying about that? That doesn't mean that everyone is equal. It doesn't mean this person is as bad as that person, but it does mean we all make these assumptions about other people. These stereotypes live in all of our heads. And so there's no putting yourself on a pedestal. There's no stamp of approval that you get in your passport saying anti-racist and now you're done. Yeah. It's a constant work.
Yeah. I completed this training, so therefore.
Exactly. Ta-da! Nothing I do is racist.
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting because there's a quote, and I'm not familiar with this author, Dorothy Chu, the person to be. And the challenge may not be lack of outrage as much as lack of psychological standing, which I think I understand a little bit better listening to you. But I think of that bumper sticker. If you're not outraged, you're asleep or something. I don't remember.
You're not paying attention.
You're not paying attention or something. And it's like, wait a minute, let's stop. Think about that. Wait a minute, what's going on here? Instead of immediately feeling outrage, let me go deeper, right? Let me think about this in a different way.
Yeah, and that helps you. First of all, Dolly Sugar is amazing. Her book, The Person You Mean to Be, is fantastic. Harvard educated, teaches social psychology at NYU. But yes, the question is, what do you do without outrage? Because the outrage is not enough, right? Putting a black square on your Instagram feed is not the same as action. And it may irritate you when people sort of derogate the actions we take on social media, but that's because if they are not connected to real life actions in the real world, they don't mean much. It's as with so many things in life, the amount of effort it requires is almost equal to the amount of value that it has. And so you have to sort of think to yourself of, okay, I'm outraged about this. Why? And what might change it? Even if there's some small thing I could do, what is the tiny little lever? How do I move the needle best? And then do that, right? If it's tiny, it's tiny. You know, you don't have to feel guilty about that. You do what you can do.
Right, right. You know, you move into, in the book, and here's another quote: being an anti-racist is not a status, but a skill you must constantly practice. And to me, that moves it into, here's some of the tools, right? Now we get into, here's the hands-on. This is what I need to look at. And you encourage readers to finish this sentence. I'd like to talk about this because, you know, I need to really explore. Okay. And it builds off, I'm outraged. Why? Why do I need to talk about this? What are my motivations? This goes back to the beginning of saying, what's my motivation and desire to be part of this conversation, to engage in this conversation?
Yeah, and it's interesting because so often we talk about race because it's been thrust upon us. And so it becomes sort of this source of dread. People avoid the conversation because they're afraid they're going to make a mistake, and then it's gonna, if they say something that's at all racist, that means something terrible about them, right? It's catastrophic. So there's one thing in which people are so afraid of these conversations that they don't talk about it at all. They avoid it. They use all these psychological techniques to run away, and one of those is, I don't see color at all. That's an avoidance technique. Right? If you don't see color, obviously there's nothing to talk about.
Right.
But if you have gotten to the step where you realize there is really great benefit and there's a lot of hopefulness in talking about this, then you need to ask about yourself, why am I having this conversation? So before you go up to that person of color and ask an Asian American at your work why model minority is not a great thing, before you ask a Hispanic American or Latinx person why they don't, celebrate Cinco de Mayo the way you think they should.
Why they don't speak Spanish, right?
Yeah. Right. Ask yourself, yeah, exactly, why they don't speak Spanish. Ask yourself why you want to know. And before you use a person of color as your Google search, first go look it up, because I guarantee you that if you start digging into some of these other cultures, if what you're doing is motivated by curiosity, you'll have real questions.
Yeah.
You won't have questions about why I can't touch a Black person's hair. You'll have questions about their ancestry and their culture and how that interacts with your own culture. You'll have real questions that they may actually want to answer. But another reason this is such an essential question is because for so many of us, the reason we enter into these conversations is to convince the other person they're wrong or bad or racist. And that is never going to work out for you.
Nope. And it's interesting because I mentioned this before, like the Geneva Convention protocols for conversations. I've never thought about it, but we really do need, here's the agreements that we're going to sign off on before we begin this conversation. And you mentioned three things: metacognition, beginner's mind, and expanding the capacity to feel empathy. And I get the empathy, because sometimes people say I'm an empath, right? That I can just feel
You
it,
kind of have to be in your job. Yeah.
right? But I didn't know about the other two, the beginner's mind. And this was a really nice exercise for me to think about why that's important in starting this conversation.
Yeah. One of these things that came to me from organizational psychology, actually, and it's something they have kept their eyes on for quite some time and been studying, which is called the expertise trap. And essentially, it really, really preys on those who are smart or those who have reached a level of expertise. And essentially, once you become an expert, there's a tendency to believe that your expertise in this one area means your opinion is better than average in every area, right? It means you think you're just smart in general. That's not quite how human intelligence works, right? You still need to hear about other people's expertises in their own areas. So what we know is that when you reach the expertise trap, your learning curve flattens or even falls. It makes you less curious. It makes you closed-minded. And this is absolutely deadly in conversations about race. Why? Because there is no encyclopedia of race that's going to give you all the answers. There is no person on earth who knows everything they need to know about race, because there's 7 billion people on the planet, which means there's 7 billion different stories about racial identity. That's what happens when something is made up.
Yeah.
It means that the truth of it rests inside the individual. And so beginner's mind allows you to approach these conversations, not saying I'm going to forget everything that I know, but saying, here's what I know so far, and look at this whole open area where I have room to grow and learn more. Let me start afresh as though I didn't know anything, and you tell me from your perspective. It's a Buddhist principle, and it's super helpful in all kinds of areas, not just talking about race.
I'm gonna dig into that more, because I think, I'm jumping a little bit, but later you talk about how listening is so important and taking turns, right? Well, I was, okay, nerd alert here, right? I was on the debate team way back in high school, right? And what does that teach you to do? I have counter arguments. It's not that I'm listening to you. It's I've already got a whole list, we used to use the 3x5 index cards. Remember those, right? I have all of those ready, counter arguments to whatever wealth of possibilities that you may bring forward. I'm ready. And listening is huge. Suspending that and really opening up your mind to, okay, let me hear what you have to say.
All the way to the end of the sentence. Yeah,
yes.
All the way to the end. Because
right.
So often we listen to the first 5 or 10 seconds of what someone's saying. We decide what it is we want to say in response, and we stop listening. We're only concentrating on what it is we want to say next. And we're just waiting for them to take a breath so we can jump in with what we're ready to say. The part of the listening portion is to try to teach you how to listen all the way to the end and then decide what you're going to say.
And to listen without forming all of those thoughts that are yours. It's that blank slate.
Yeah.
Truly listening to somebody's, that's interesting. That's a whole 7-hour training in itself. It's
if not more. Yeah, absolutely.
I couldn't believe, actually, there was a quote by Fred Rogers. And if you don't mind, I think we're okay for time. I think I'm going to read this because I just thought it was
please.
Incredible. If you could only sense how important you are to the lives of those you meet, how important you can be to the people you may never even dream of, there is something of yourself that you leave at every meeting with another person. This is so perfect that Mr. Rogers said this, and that, you go into a discussion about civility and respect and acceptance, and wow, again, that could be an entire book instead of just,
we don't like to use the word civility, and I try to go into the reasons why, because they're absolutely credible and understandable. So maybe instead of civility, you use the phrase mutual respect. And that's, in the end, we're talking about the same thing. We're simply, and this goes back to what you mentioned earlier, which is the Geneva Convention of protocols for conversations, right? We rarely think these days about the ethics of conversation. But this is something that occupied the minds of some of the most brilliant people in the world for hundreds, if not thousands of years. They thought about things like rhetoric, and that included this consideration of ethics. One of the things that I wanted to make sure that I did in the book was include a whole bunch of interviews. And I didn't want to just quote the people. I wanted the reader to be able to see the back and forth between me and these other people. And one of the people I interviewed was an ethicist. And his was one of the most fascinating discussions I have, to sort of force you to think about, what is my obligation to this person I'm speaking to? Right. And, in this case, we borrow something here from another area, that it would be the area of gender equity and sexual ethics, in that when you're talking about race, you have to establish consent. That's not just a white person making sure that that person of color is ready to have that conversation, because it can be exhausting. But one of the questions I ask is, if somebody says something that's a microaggression, if someone, says, oh God, I love Black people, they're so athletic, microaggression. Does that equal consent for you to talk to them about race? I don't give the answer in the book. I want people to think about that. Is that the same thing as unspoken consent? And I want people to think about this, because talking about race is volatile. It's very emotional. It involves our very core identities. And so we just have to be respectful of each other's space and privacy before we try to engage them in these conversations. Otherwise, what's the point? It takes us again back to what your goal is. If you're going into this conversation without consent, someone is being harassed, and you will achieve nothing. So this is sort of where I wanted to go with this discussion of ethics and our responsibility to one another in these conversations, to think about that, which again, we just don't think about very much.
And it's interesting, we quickly post things and repost things and comment on and like or dislike. And that's not a conversation. Back to what you said, you're not having a conversation on your phone, on social media about these topics. Too many times we only have these conversations right after George Floyd was murdered, Jacob Blake was murdered or shot, right after some tragedy like this. We're outraged. Our emotions are up, and is that the right time? Is that, if we're following this discourse in the ethics of conversation, this isn't the right time?
No, it's very often not. And there's a few reasons for that. One of them is that, frankly, when a person of color watches this video or sees these headlines and has to read, and this isn't just Black people, it's very often Black people in the United States. It is also a Latinx person seeing what's happening at the border and seeing children in cages. It is an Asian American person watching a video of an elder being knocked down in the street, right? That's traumatic. And that may not be the right time to talk to that person. It is okay, though, to establish that consent. In other words, I think it's important to let somebody know that you are there if they need them, to let them know that you're thinking about them, that it has occurred to you that this might be upsetting to them, and say, hey, I can't imagine what you're going through. This was upsetting to me, and so it must be tenfold for you. You don't have to talk about it. I just want you to know that should you need anything, I'm here for you. Just let me know. And then you can walk away, right? You don't need to get into some big conversation with anybody at that point. You've just let them know that the possibility is there. But then again, if they ask you for something, it may not be for a conversation. It may be, can you take care of this work? I'm going home early. Can you order lunch for me? I can't get my mind around it. And that's okay too.
Right. Right. It's a challenge, right? I mean, you actually, or I don't know if this was, as we prepare for Thanksgiving, it's around the corner and we're about to embark on being with family, etc. And do we have an uncle or an aunt that's going to say something?
Yeah.
That's going to trigger us. And how do we have that conversation? And the difficulty, right? Because there's the stranger in the grocery store that says something, and you talk about that safety and evaluating, are you feeling safe here? Is this a safe to intervene in some way?
Right.
Versus around the Thanksgiving table, around the, whatever it might be. What do you want to accomplish? Why do you want to have that conversation? Talk to us a little bit about that evaluation in our brain. How do we, just assess, wait a minute, this isn't the right time. This person isn't ready for this. I don't, it's hard because I feel passionate.
Yeah.
Say something, right?
So it is really important to think it through. And part of the reasons is our answer so often is it's not the right time, right? We come up with more justifications why we shouldn't have that conversation than we do for why we're not going to go to the gym today. We seem to always have a really credible reason why this isn't a good time to have that conversation. And that may be true, but one of the things I want people to think about is that the person who is most likely to convince your racist grandmother or uncle or whatever is the person that he or she loves and resembles the most. That's you. So when you eschew that responsibility, when you say, I don't want to do this again this year, what you're basically doing is letting them loose on the world where they are probably going to make some person of color really unhappy and possibly traumatized. You are letting that person loose. Now, are you responsible for someone else's beliefs? Of course you're not, but you are the person most likely able to affect change. And therefore, try it and keep trying it. If that means you have a 5-minute exchange before they say something that is over the line and you say, I'm not going to have this conversation with you, that's when you have to speak. If that's the way you're going to speak and you shut it down, that's great. But then when you see them again for the holidays, try it again for 5 minutes and again and again. The other thing is set boundaries and then stick by them. I have a friend who would tell her grandpa, if you use that language, I'm not bringing the grandkids over. But then she never held to it. He would say those things and she'd say, I told you, if you keep talking that way, I'm not going to bring them over. And I told her at that point, when he says it, you get up out of the house and you leave. Not only do you need him to learn, you need your kids to see you do that.
Right. You ask, and I'm not remembering where, I think it's at the beginning, you ask a series of questions. Is that based on fact? Is that based on, like, if somebody says, all Cubans didn't know how to dance, that's one of those positive stereotypes, right? But then they have a dance and, it's like that blows that stereotype out the water, right? You ask a whole series of questions, which are really helpful of like, wait a minute, where do you get that from? What's your study? What's your source? I mean, and I can't remember all of them, but I thought that was a useful exercise to challenge somebody.
Right. And this is essentially the Socratic method to a certain extent, right? But it's Socratic method that's not meant to you're not trying to berate someone or beat them down or prove them wrong. You're asking these questions out of genuine curiosity. So somebody says something that is absolutely offensive and you say, I don't see it from that perspective. What's your source on that? Where did you learn that? Where did you hear that? Why is this so important to you? Why is this particular fact of relevance to you? Why are you saying it to me? And you can use these questions. It's really interesting. One of the things that we know when we talked about confirmation bias is very tough to break. By the way, human beings are the only ones who suffer from confirmation bias, the only species. We are the only ones who will believe something, and then we're shown evidence proving that what we believe is untrue, and that makes us believe it harder. That's what confirmation bias is. It is extremely tough to break. But one of the only ways that we have found that actually works is when you force someone to walk to them to articulate their entire opinion and go into detail. So you'll say, what's your opinion on merit pay for teachers? And they'll give you their opinion. You'll say, okay, what would that look like if your opinion were actually put into law? You know, how would that work? And you ask them the questions all the way through. And they have seen in research studies that by the end of that questioning, the person says, you know, that may not be right.
Yeah.
That's an incredible result, right? To get people to doubt their own opinions. We haven't found that in any other way. But if you use these questions that way where they have to walk you through it, there's just a chance that it may make them see things from another perspective.
It may challenge that viewpoint that they hold.
But it's self-persuasion, right?
Yes, exactly.
They are being challenged themselves to articulate and explain. And when you bring some of these talking points down to earth and have to actually make them real, it's very difficult.
Let me get to a very selfish question, self-interest here. As VP of Equity and Inclusion at Madison College, I want to talk about race in the workplace.
Yeah.
I do. I want to talk about inequities. We're not there yet. We've got to work on this. But you end up the book. How do we talk about race in the workplace? This is a difficult area.
Yeah.
People have said it to me. I don't know what I know. I don't want to screw up. What if I get fired if I say something that's not appropriate? And, you know, I've heard this. You've probably heard the same thing. How do we bring this into the workplace? How do we do this in a way that, again, we need to move this needle. We need to provide those safe places. But how do we do this?
One thing is we have to be honest with ourselves that the diversity training we've been using for years does not work. Not only does it not work, there's some evidence that it actually backfires and raises the likelihood of acts of bias and discrimination. So we have to stop playing those videos and having these discussion groups where everyone gets emotional and people of color are forced to share these traumatic things that they've been told and have happened to them. And it changes the minds of not a single white person in the entire group or anyone's mind for that matter. So stop doing that.
Yeah.
The other thing is you have to create a culture of correction. So you have to create a culture in which it is expected that people will make mistakes. We're not talking about overt racism here. We're not talking about damaging discrimination. That's a different discussion. For the most part, we're talking about microaggressions. Let's hire this Asian American person. They're always so detail oriented, right? What's sometimes known as friendly racism, or the unconscious bias that leads someone to feel in their gut that white men are just going to be better leaders. That's what we're talking about here. You have to create a culture in which it is expected that people are going to make mistakes because they will, right? They will. And so therefore you ask yourself, okay, knowing that people are going to say the wrong thing, then what? What is our protocol when someone says the wrong thing? And that is what you hold people accountable to. Does everyone have to give an apology? Of course they do. What is okay? What are the correct ways to interrupt that microaggression? And there's a really good way that I'm going to tell you about. This was called the STAR system, which stands for Stop, Tell, Assist, Restore. I actually made a YouTube video explaining this whole system. So that this is how you interrupt a microaggression. You stop it. You interrupt it immediately as much as you can. You do not let them finish that sentence. Then you're going to tell them, you're going to say, and you're going to take it on yourself You're not going to say, wow, that would really upset the Black people in this organization. Or, we have Latinx people here. That's not what you say. You say, I don't agree with that perspective, or I find that inappropriate. That you're telling them that it's wrong what they've just said. Then you're going to assist them. You assist them by explaining why you have a problem with what they've said. I see that from a different perspective. I'm surprised that you feel that's appropriate. As I see it, not so appropriate. Here's why I see it this way. And then you're going to restore them. And this is the part people have so much trouble with. But it's the most important part. Essentially, you're restoring their humanity. And it goes something like this. I know you're the kind of person who wants to create an inclusive workplace. I know you want to be fair. And so that's why it surprises me to hear you say something like this. I just wanted to point it out, so that you can make sure to watch for it in the future. You're restoring themselves to their better self, reminding them of who they believe they are. The thing is that when you talk about self-persuasion, which is one of the most effective ways to change minds, is for them to persuade themselves. One of the ways that you can do this is by using cognitive dissonance. So for example, most people believe they are not racist. Most people believe that they are fair and inclusive. So when someone says, wow, what you just said was racist, they experience a very painful form of cognitive dissonance in which you have just said that their behavior does not match this picture they have of themselves. And they can justify this, they can relieve this mental pain a few ways. One, they can say, uh-oh, I just did something racist. That's not who I am. I'm never doing that again. I'm going to work on this till I don't do that again. And then I can return to this. Or a very common way is to say, no, it wasn't racist. And you go right back. If you can dismiss that completely, it was not racist. I was joking. You're overly sensitive.
Yeah, exactly.
Then you can still maintain this idea of yourself. But that's a delusion, right? So you have to create this culture of correction in the workplace in which it's okay for someone to say, I try to give examples of mistakes I've made. And there was one point where I used the word paddy wagon, which it turns out is very racially tinged. And if I were to say that in the workplace, we need to create the kind of environment in which it's not catastrophic for me to have made that mistake, that it's okay for someone else to point it out, and that we have this sort of script in place. Here's what you do, so that I don't become defensive, you don't become angry. We understand how this goes. And again, you can role model this. You can literally role play this so that people have practice doing it. So in the moment, it's just second nature for someone to say, whoa. And again, one more thing I suggest, especially in the workplace, is take use of the time. Remember, we were talking about system 1, system 2 thinking. Give yourself space by making your interruption something like, wait, what? Or hold on. And then take that space to collect your thoughts and figure out how you want to stop. Sometimes, even if you just say, what did you just say? And you make them repeat it, sometimes that's enough.
We use words like minority, majority, right? The minorities. And how do we, not correct, but, how to use this method and thinking, wait a minute, let's think this out about minority, majority. What does that mean? How do we really dig deeper? Do you get the impression that a majority is dominant in more than numbers, and minority is maybe just talking about race and ethnicity, but how about other identity characteristics, ability, disability, sexual orientation, sexual identity? There's a variety of things, right? And minority, majority seems not to take those into consideration. And how do we have those discussions, even just about simple language that we throw out, right? We just throw out these words. And some of them there's power behind them, like you mentioned, paddy wagon, let's powwow. There's tons of just, expressions that this country has that, oh my gosh, we don't know the history behind it.
Yeah.
Stop.
And it's really common. So one of the things that you can do here is, really one of the reasons that diversity training doesn't work is because it approaches racism as though it's a knowledge problem, right? As though once people realize that it's wrong, they will align their values to what's right and then behave appropriately. Well, we know that's not true, and yet we keep trying it. We're going to show them another video that explains why this is wrong. This hurts people of color, right? It doesn't work. We could spend an entire other book explaining why standard diversity training doesn't work, but it doesn't work. Okay, so this knowledge problem we need to let go of, and instead forget people's values. What you've brought up of these terms and having these conversations about terms is exactly how you do diversity training. You do it through collaborative problem solving. Essentially, we actually know a lot about how to change people's behavior. Behavioral science is quite robust. We know it because we know how to get people to buy things on Black Friday, right? We know how to get people to put on seatbelts. Like, there's a lot that we know about behavioral science, and you can use this in your workplace because instead of changing values, you change behavior. And collaborative problem solving, human beings are naturally drawn to work together to solve a common problem. So you say to themselves, hey, look, we just looked through our employee handbook, and the diversity statement is out of date. It uses the words majority, minority. This is our problem. We're going to solve this. Let's solve this together. And approaching it that way, where you're going to get together as a team to figure out a better way, not only does it solve that problem of what's a better term, but it also will bind the team together. They may not like each other, but we have actually no evidence that people who like each other work better together. You don't have to like anybody. You just have to know how to work well together. And that's that behavior piece. So again, all throughout the book, what I was trying to do was saying, this is how your brain and body and your emotions work. Use them in your favor, right? Let them work for you rather than trying to deny things or run away from stuff. It's so much easier when you do what comes naturally to yourself.
This is, gosh, we are going to talk about coming back to Madison College. Just put that on your in your calendar. That Connor had said that he was going to put some questions in the chat. I don't know if this is the right time. I'm going to wait for just a second, but maybe while we're waiting for Connor, you've given me a lot of advice, and I almost feel like I need to start all over again. I mean, I used to be invited during Hispanic Heritage Month, to come talk about the Latinx community and tell us everything you know about Hispanics. And I'm Cuban. I can tell you a little bit about my experience as a Cuban. And I left the country when I was 5, and you can probably do the math of how old I am, right? So I have lived
40, right? You're 40, yeah.
Exactly. There we go.
Yeah.
I've lived the majority of my life in the United States. I used to listen to American music way more than Cuban music. I grew up on Bob Marley, not on boleros and Omar Portundo. I mean, that wasn't what I grew up with. You rebel against your family,
Yeah,
right?
of course you do. Yeah.
So it has changed of like, okay, that didn't work. Let me tell you, here's information about Latinos or Hispanic, or why we should celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month. And here's a taco meal along with it, right? And we need to move further. That didn't really move the needle on where Latinos are in this country. And Black History Month hasn't done that either.
I hate Black History Month.
Yeah.
What
are we doing here? What are we doing with these? Connor writes, what is a good way to initiate a conversation with someone of another background when you're interested in knowing more about their racial identity? So
that's actually, Yeah, this actually ties back into what you're saying. I actually had a neighbor who said, you keep using that word Latinx. And I asked my neighbor if I should say Latinx, and she said no. She didn't want to be called Latinx. And I said, well, that's fair. Where is she from? And he said, well, she's from Guatemala. And I said, she probably wants to be called Guatemalan American.
Yeah. Yeah.
So one of the ways that you initiate this common conversation is by having it as personal and specific to the person standing in front of you as possible. Instead of stereotypes, like I talk to all of my Lyft drivers, my rideshare drivers. And if they have an accent, I say, oh, where is your accent from? And they'll say, you know, Ethiopia. And I'll say, where you live in Ethiopia? And they'll tell me, and I'll look it up on the map, and I'll be like, oh, right near such and such river. What does it look like? What's the weather like?
Right.
You know, when did you come to the States? Do you get back to your native country? Where's your family? Did they come with you?
Right.
You're asking them questions about their own life and their own story, not in a stereotypical way,
Right.
but just you want to hear their story. Everybody has a story to tell,
Right.
everyone. So ask them about themselves, not about the Blacks, not about the Hispanics, but about this particular Cuban American or Guatemalan American person in front of you.
And many times, how do we connect? You know, we tend to look at your bookshelves in the back. Wow, those are cool. Where'd you get them? That's your initial conversation. Then then you share where you got them. Sometimes we think, oh, because I'm talking to a Black person, a Latina or whatever, I have to talk about their background. Well, do you? Is there a way to enter that conversation, to have a curious conversation, and then it gets deeper, right? It gets, you build a trust, you build a relationship. Do you have evidence? This is another question. Do you have evidence that will bolster my hope that we're actually making progress in the realm of what you're talking about and envisioning? This is from Karen Crosley. Hello, Karen.
Not really. There is a little bit of evidence. For example, more white Americans than ever before are willing to admit that people of color suffer from discrimination in a tangible and real way. At the same time, a majority of white Americans believe that racism against white people is worse than racism against Black people. So it's like for every statistic I could give you that offers you a little bit of, oh, here's some progress, I can give you another one that kind of destroys it. I don't think for each of us, you know, I'm not president. I have no desire to be president. I would be a terrible president. So I don't have to worry about the health of the nation. I worry about the health of my family and my community. And so the hope that you have that progress can be made is when you, Karen, actually have a surprisingly positive conversation about race with someone else. That's your data point. And every time that happens, it's going to give you more hope. And it's going to encourage you, and it's going to make you willing to go out and try it again and again and again. And when I was a little kid, there was a shampoo commercial, you know, where they'd go, I told my friend, and then she told her friend, and she told her friend, and then it ends up with this whole screen full of people washing their hair with that shampoo. I want these talks about racism to be like that shampoo, that each one of us is sort of spreading this out among ourselves, showing there's nothing to be afraid of in these conversations about race. If we can treat each other with respect and some compassion, then we can talk about these race and allow ourselves to say boneheaded things and say wonderful things, and each one will convince you to have the next one.
And that we still have that humanity.
Yes.
That we still see that humanity in each other. That's the thing. Too many times we're dismissing people. You know, you said a boneheaded thing, I don't ever want to talk to you again.
Exactly.
And
yeah, it's what people mistakenly call cancel culture. That's not, honestly, please stop using the phrase cancel culture. Just stop using that and stop using woke. We could go into why, but I just beg of you, please just let that go. Yes, we tend to think that if somebody says something racist, that there's no point in talking to them. And I want to give people of color a pass here, because they have been hurt so many times. And white people haven't always done their homework. But the fact of the matter is that every single time these diversity discussions come up, it's put on the shoulders of people of color. You're the director of this department, when honestly, there should be no need for a diversity department. If your company is working the way that it's supposed to, you don't need a diversity and inclusion department. You don't need one. It's baked into the policies of your company. But also, why does it always have to be a person of color? You know why it does? Because that's the only job you're going to give them. You'll see an entire executive board that's all white people and mostly male, and then there's one person of color, it's their diversity and inclusion officer. So I need white people to understand that this is your work, and that shouldn't be an onus. That's an opportunity. Like, this generation has a chance to change the history of the world. And statistics show us that white people, especially white men, are the most convincing when it comes to these conversations about race. They're the least likely to suffer penalties for it, whereas people of color suffer greatly when they bring up issues of race, just like women suffer greatly when they bring up issues of sexism. So white people, and especially white men, you can do this. You have the power to really do this. Like, that should be, I hope that's exciting, because wow, let's take it back full circle to where we talked about what this world could look like if Frederick Douglass didn't have to be campaigning to not have Black people in chains. What would he have done? What would Maya Angelou have written about? What would Toni Morrison have written about? Just imagine that kind of world, and my white brothers and sisters, you can actually make that happen. You have the power to do that. So again, that's a real source of, I think, hope.
I love to end this like that, to think about what is our hope in having these discussions, in creating that safe space for us. And I always talk about, I'd love to work myself out of a job. I'd love to, it's time that we don't need a separate office of equity and inclusion, that equity and inclusion is so embedded in everything we do. We don't need a separate office. It's just there. It's always there. So I love this. I love thinking about the hope and imagining. Give us one last piece of advice, as I think we've got maybe 2 minutes left. I'm so appreciative of this time, and I feel like this is just a beginning, but leave us with some advice.
So, James Baldwin has had a little bit of a resurgence. And one of the reasons why we quote James Baldwin all the time is because he just said everything better than anybody else can. So why try to rephrase it, right? But I want to remind you that he died in the 80s, and we didn't listen to him while he was alive. Mm-hmm. He was a successful novelist, but we didn't actually listen to him. Mm-hmm. And my book is intended to make sure we don't make that mistake again. Mm-hmm. Who's our James Baldwin of today that we're not listening to? And let's stop and listen while we still have them in their midst, and actually really listen in a transformative way. Because, again, I go back to the fact that we can be the generation that ends this. We really can.
Thank you. Thank you, Celeste. This has been just incredible. I'm so grateful to have you speak to us in Wisconsin. It's changing. The weather's changing here. We're getting colder. So we need these kinds of warm events to keep us in this fight. And I agree, we can do this. So thank you.
Thanks for having the conversation.
And don't forget to get your free book. I don't know where that magical signing up is, but right there. Okay, I can't see.
Green button.
It's a green button. It's right there. Well, Lucia, Celeste, thank you so much. I think what a wonderful note to go out on. I think that we know maybe one of the people that we should be listening to. Celeste, thank you so much for this book. And Lucia, I can't agree more. This is the beginning of a conversation. Without this book, we might not know as much as we now know about how to do it. I hope that everyone will avail themselves of it, get a free copy sent to you at your home, and start having these conversations. I can't tell you how much I completely agree with white men have a distinct privilege in this space and a role, and it is an opportunity, and we should all take it for what it's worth. So thank you so much, Celeste, for your time tonight. If you want to hear more from Celeste, you can find her on Retro Report. Visit her website. There's just the What I'm Doing Now is 53 things, and I'm so happy that you did this with us tonight. So thank you so very much, and maybe we will see you here in Madison sometime in the future along with Madison College. Lucia,
Absolutely.
thank you as
I
well
hope
for
so
your
too.
questions. It was wonderful. Good night, everyone.
Night.